The text popped up while I was finishing a contract review at the office. "Congratulations! Brian officially takes over American Company today. We're so proud." I read it 3 times before my brain even registered the words. My fingers went cold. My breath snagged on the air like a fishhook in my chest. I pushed my chair back so hard it bumped the cubicle wall. Colleagues glanced up, concerned. I just shook my head, grabbed my bag, and walked out to the parking lot. Once I was alone in my car, I locked the doors, sat there with my hands clenched in my lap, trying to steady the wild pounding in my ears. 6 months ago, I saved that damn company. Took out a second mortgage. Wired $240,000 of my own money to cover payroll, utilities, suppliers, everything Dad's insurance didn't. And now they just erased me. My phone buzzed again. Another text, this time from Mom. "Hope you understand, sweetheart. Brian really needs this chance." My vision blurred. The betrayal had a taste, metallic, like old pennies pressing into my tongue. I dropped the phone onto the passenger seat and leaned back, closed my eyes. I thought about the late nights last winter, combing through financial statements so grim I could hardly breathe. How I sat beside Dad's hospital bed, promising him I'd fix everything. How I never once hesitated. The air in the car grew hot and stale. I rolled down the window, gulping cold air like it might wash the bitterness off my skin. I could still hear Dad's voice back then, weak but proud, saying, "You saved our legacy, Lisa. You're the only reason American Company survived." Guess that didn't count when Brian needed another bailout. I sat there long enough for the sky to start bruising purple. The parking lot emptied out around me. Still, I couldn't move. Finally, I jammed the keys into the ignition and peeled out of the lot. Not toward home, not toward family, toward the one place nobody else would bother to look. The American Company archives. The old storage building we used before we went digital, now just a dusty graveyard of paper and busted filing cabinets. Something twisted deep in my gut as I pulled into the abandoned lot. If they thought they could write me off like a bad debt, they'd forgotten one very important thing. I read the fine print, and I never forget. The padlock on the storage building hung loose, almost sad-looking. Brian must have forgotten it after one of his clean-out days. Typical. I shoved the door open with my shoulder. The air inside hit me like a punch. Old paper, mildew, something sour lurking under it all. The only light came from a dusty skylight overhead, casting a dull gray glow over stacks of battered file boxes. I pulled my hoodie tighter, stepped inside, and let the door swing shut behind me. The click echoed like a gunshot in the emptiness. Somewhere deep inside, my heartbeat started to sink to a different rhythm. Not panic, purpose. Row after row of crumbling records stretched out before me. Old client files, tax returns, shareholder agreements. Bingo. I dropped to my knees in front of a battered metal filing cabinet. The drawers screeched in protest as I yanked them open. Loose papers rained out onto the dusty concrete. I raked through them, my hands moving fast, brain faster. It wasn't just money at stake. It was everything. Halfway through the second drawer, my fingers snagged on something thicker. A leather binder, cracked along the spine. The company's original shareholder agreement. My mouth went dry. I slid it out carefully, like handling a loaded weapon. The pages inside were yellowed, the ink faded but still legible. I flipped past the obvious stuff, ownership percentages, dividend rules, until I hit a paragraph marked in bold, right of first refusal in case of ownership transfer. I blinked, leaned closer, heart hammering now. According to the clause, if Merrick and Company shares were ever sold or transferred, the company had to offer them first to the original shareholder, or their named heir, before any transfer could be finalized. And guess whose name was handwritten in the margin, next to named heir, in shaky familiar script? Mine. Lisa Ann Merrick. I let out a short, disbelieving laugh. The sound bounced off the empty walls, brittle and sharp. They never updated the documents. Not when I bailed them out. Not when Dad got sick. Not when Brian's debts started bleeding the company dry. Which meant, legally, Brian didn't own American Company. I did. The thought hit me like a bolt of ice water down my spine. I clutched the binder tight to my chest, rising to my feet. Dust motes danced in the slanted sunlight around me, like tiny sparks. I wasn't erased. I wasn't powerless. I just hadn't played my hand yet. But I was about to. I didn't drive straight home. Too dangerous. I headed to Dean's office instead. Dean Lomas, my old college buddy, was now a real estate attorney with a side hustle in corporate law, sharp as a scalpel, loyal as hell. He opened the door himself, tie loosened, sleeves rolled up. The smell of burnt coffee and worn leather books clung to the place. "Lisa?" He blinked, surprised. "You look like you just robbed a bank." I lifted the binder. "Close enough." He ushered me inside without another word. We sat at his cluttered desk, knees almost bumping. I flipped open the shareholder agreement, pointing to the critical clause with a trembling finger. Dean's eyes narrowed as he read. Slowly, a grin started curling at the edge of his mouth. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, tapping the paper. "You've got them by the throat." Relief sagged my shoulders, but only for a second. "How do I make it official?" I asked. "Before Brian burns the whole thing down?" Dean leaned back, steepling his fingers. "You'll need to serve a formal notice, demand enforcement of your right of first refusal. If they refuse, or pretend it's invalid, you can sue." "And if the company's already hemorrhaging assets?" I asked, voice low. He shrugged. "Better move fast. File the notice before he sells off anything else." I sank deeper into the chair, clutching my forehead. This wasn't just revenge. It was survival. Dean pulled out a legal pad, scribbling. "We'll draft it tonight. File it by morning. And Lisa," he paused, looking at me dead serious, "don't tip them off early. No warning shots, not even your mom." I nodded grimly. I learned that lesson the hard way. While Dean drafted the paperwork, I dug through my old email archives on my laptop. There they were, dozens of thank you emails from Dad. Bank transfer receipts showing my $240,000 wired straight into American Co.'s operating account. Internal memos referring to me as interim financial controller. Every breadcrumb I needed to prove my role, my investment, my right. By midnight, the official demand letter sat freshly printed between us, still warm from the printer. I stared at it. So small, so simple. But in the right hands, it was a stick of dynamite. Dean slid it into a manila envelope, sealing it with a firm slap. "You ready to blow it all up?" he asked. I looked him dead in the eye. "No," I said, sliding the envelope into my bag. "I'm ready to take what's mine." I didn't sleep that night. I watched the sun crawl up over the skyline from my couch, clutching a cold mug of coffee. Every nerve in my body thrummed like a plucked wire. At 9 a.m. sharp, I walked into American Co.'s main office. My heels clicked hard against the polished tile. Each step sounded louder than the last. The receptionist, some new girl who didn't know me, offered a nervous smile. "Can I help you?" I set the envelope on the counter like I was planting a flag. "This is for Brian Merrick. Immediate delivery." Before she could answer, the elevator dinged. Brian himself swaggered out, laughing at something on his phone. When he spotted me, his face shifted fast. First smug, then suspicious. "Lisa," he drawled, stuffing his phone into his back pocket. "What, coming by to congratulate me?" I gave a tight smile. "Not exactly." The receptionist slid the envelope across the counter toward him, her hands shaky. Brian picked it up, frowning. He tore it open right there, skimming the first page. Color drained from his face faster than a summer storm rolling in. His mouth opened once, twice. No words. Finally, he looked up at me, wild-eyed. "What the hell is this?" I kept my voice even. "A formal notice to exercise my right of first refusal." "You're bluffing," he snapped. "Nope," I said, crossing my arms. "Clause 14B. Check your bylaws." He glanced down again, flipping pages like maybe if he moved fast enough, he could outrun the truth. "You can't do this," he hissed under his breath. "This isn't yours." I leaned in slightly. "It was never yours to give away." Brian's hands trembled slightly, crumpling the corner of the letter. Behind him, a couple of employees had stopped pretending not to eavesdrop. Their curious stares burned hotter than the overhead lights. I stepped back, giving him space to stew. "Legal response is due within 3 business days," I added, nice and calm. "Failure to comply means a court order freezing all company assets." Brian blinked fast, sweat beading at his hairline. It was the first time I ever saw him truly rattled. Good. He should be scared. Without another word, I turned on my heel and walked out the door. The air outside hit my face like a baptism. 3 steps down the concrete path, my phone buzzed. It was Mrs. Keating, our oldest employee. Her text was short, almost a whisper through the screen. "You need to see what he's planning next. Meet me tonight." Mrs. Keating lived in the same little brick bungalow she had since 1972. The porch sagged a little, but the windows gleamed spotless. Like her, tough, steady, no nonsense. She opened the door before I could knock. "Get in here, girl," she whispered, yanking me inside. I barely had time to kick off my boots before she shoved a manila folder into my hands. Inside, printed emails, property listings, and hastily scribbled notes. "He's gutting it," she said, voice low. "Brian's trying to sell off company properties before your notice locks him down." I skimmed the pages, heart thudding. He had already listed 2 warehouses and a company-owned condo in Clearwater, as urgent sales no less, priced to move fast. "He's desperate," I muttered. "Desperate men make stupid mistakes," Mrs. Keating said, her eyes sharp. One email caught my eye. It was between Brian and a broker I recognized, a slimy guy who'd been banned from 2 real estate boards for shady deals. The timestamp was yesterday. "How long do you think before he closes one of these sales?" I asked. Mrs. Keating shrugged, worry lining her face. "Could be days. Could be hours." I raked a hand through my hair. If he liquidated assets before I gained control, it'd be hell to untangle the mess. And good luck getting the money back once he blew through it. "I need a restraining order on company transactions," I muttered. Mrs. Keating nodded. "And fast." I stuffed the papers back into the folder, clutching it to my chest. Mrs. Keating grabbed my wrist before I could rush out the door. "You're not just saving yourself, Lisa," she said, voice low. "You're saving the rest of us too." Her words hit harder than she probably knew. Faces flashed through my mind. Mike from the loading dock, who just had a new baby. Tasha in accounting, who worked 2 jobs to put her daughter through school. All the people who counted on American Company being steady, honest, right. I nodded once, hard. "I won't let him destroy it," I said. "I swear." Mrs. Keating's smile was small but fierce. "Good girl." Outside, night had fallen hard and fast. The streetlights flickered as I sprinted back to my car. I jammed the key into the ignition with shaking hands. Tomorrow wasn't just about reclaiming the company. It was about putting Brian in a corner so tight he couldn't wriggle free. I revved the engine and sped toward Dean's office. It was time to escalate. And Brian Merrick was about to find out what real leverage looked like. Dean was still in his office when I burst through the door. His tie was gone, his hair a mess, like he'd been living off caffeine and stubbornness all day. "Tell me you brought dynamite," he said, without even looking up. I slammed the manila folder onto his desk. "Try C4. He flipped through the papers, eyebrows lifting higher with every page. By the time he finished, his mouth was a hard, grim line. "Asset stripping," he muttered. "And fast, too. He's moving like a rat off a sinking ship." I dropped into the chair across from him, exhaustion slamming into me all at once. "Can we stop him?" Dean nodded slowly, already pulling up legal templates on his computer. "We can file an emergency injunction. Freeze all company assets until the ownership dispute is settled." "How fast?" I asked. "Tonight, fast," he said, glancing at the clock. "Judge Carpenter's still on call. If we get lucky, she'll sign it before morning." Hope flared in my chest like a match struck in the dark. Dean worked like a man possessed, hammering keys, muttering under his breath. I sat still, the silence in my chest growing heavier with every minute. This wasn't just paperwork anymore. It was war. 30 minutes later, Dean leaned back, stretching his arms over his head. "It's ready." He spun the laptop toward me. "Read it. Sign it. We file electronically and serve notice at dawn." I skimmed the document. Every line was sharp, surgical, nailing Brian's actions to the wall without leaving room to wriggle. Dean was good. Real good. At the bottom of the last page, I hesitated for just a second. Once I signed, there was no turning back. No family dinners. No fake smiles at Thanksgiving. No pretending it had all just been a misunderstanding. I picked up the pen anyway, signed my name in steady, bold strokes. Dean hit send. It was done. He leaned back, exhaling slow. "You'll get a hearing notice by 7 a.m., he said. "If she approves it, every single asset, bank accounts, properties, contracts, goes into lockdown. Brian won't be able to sell a paperclip without permission. I nodded, heart slamming against my ribs. Good, let him squirm. Dean smiled grimly. You're not just winning this fight, Lisa. You're making sure he can't torch the house on the way out. I gathered my things, slipping into the cool night air. The stars were faint above the city, smudged by haze, but I found one and made a silent promise. By the time the sun rose, Brian's empire of lies would start to crumble, and I'd be the one kicking the first brick loose. The courthouse smelled like old coffee and floor polish. I sat on the hard wooden bench outside courtroom 4B, tapping my foot so fast it blurred. Dean slid into the seat beside me, clutching a thick folder of exhibits. You good? He asked under his breath. I nodded once, even though my hands trembled inside my coat pockets. Fake it till you make it. The bailiff swung open the courtroom door. Case 2475. Merrick versus Merrick. Both parties present. Brian swaggered past us, his lawyer. A sweaty guy in a crooked tie, jogging to keep up. Brian's face was all fake confidence, but his eyes? They darted everywhere, frantic. Dean and I stood and followed them inside. The courtroom was nearly empty, just a sleepy clerk, a weary judge, and the smell of battle hanging thick in the air. We took our places. Dean whispered, straight facts, no drama, let the paperwork tell the story. Judge Carpenter peered over her glasses, shuffling the motion Dean had filed. Ms. Merrick, you're seeking an emergency injunction freezing Merrick & Co.'s assets, pending adjudication of ownership rights? Dean stood, voice steady. Yes, Your Honor. Based on a binding right of first refusal clause my client holds, and clear evidence the current acting manager is attempting to liquidate corporate property in violation of that right. The judge arched one skeptical eyebrow. Evidence? Dean handed up the folder. Emails, listings, bank statements, all wrapped in a neat, damning bow. Brian's lawyer scrambled to object. Your Honor, this is all circumstantial. There's no proof my client acted in bad faith. The judge held up one hand, silencing him. Then she read. 5 minutes passed. 10. Every second scraped across my skin like sandpaper. Finally, she set the folder down and folded her hands. Mr. Merrick, she said, fixing Brian with a stare so cold I could feel it from 3 rows away. It appears your client attempted to sell corporate assets without disclosing existing legal obligations. Brian opened his mouth to protest. The judge cut him off with a sharp rap of her pen against the bench. Injunction granted. Effective immediately, Merrick & Co.'s assets are frozen pending further order of this court. Any violation will be considered contempt and prosecuted accordingly. Dean squeezed my hand under the table, a tiny, fierce squeeze that said we did it. Brian, meanwhile, looked like someone had just yanked the ground out from under him. As we walked out of the courtroom, I caught the edge of his hissed whisper to his lawyer. Fix it. I don't care how. But deep down, we both knew. There was no fixing this. The second I got back to my car, my phone buzzed. Caller ID. Carol Merrick. Mom. I stared at the screen, thumb hovering. Part of me itched to answer, to hear whatever excuse she'd cooked up. The smarter part slid the phone back into my bag and drove away. If she wanted to plead for Brian, she could save her breath. Instead of heading home, I swung by Dean's office. I barely got through the door before he held up a hand. You're gonna want to see this, he said grimly. He turned his laptop toward me. An email chain was open on the screen. One forwarded from Mrs. Keating. My stomach dropped. Brian wasn't just panicking. He was scheming. He had fired off a mass email to shareholders, mostly distant cousins and old family friends, claiming I was mentally unstable and acting out of revenge, begging them to vote no confidence in me before the next shareholders' meeting. Painting himself as the poor, misunderstood hero trying to, quote, save the company from internal sabotage. Dean leaned back, arms crossed. The smear campaign started faster than I thought. I stared at the screen. My hands were perfectly still. I didn't feel rage, not sadness either. Just a cold, sharp clarity slicing through my ribs. Brian thought he could spin this, play the victim, rewrite history. He had no idea he was standing on a trapdoor. I closed the laptop slowly. Fine, I said. He wants to make this public? Let's make it real public. Dean grinned. I was hoping you'd say that. He opened another folder on his desk. Inside, a treasure trove of documentation. Old emails thanking me for the $240,000 bailout. Board meeting notes where Dad officially credited me with saving the firm. Photos of me signing the interim control agreements. Receipts, wire transfers, handwritten thank you cards from employees. Evidence, Dean said simply. And a hell of a lot of it. We spent the next 2 hours assembling a full shareholder packet. Clean, brutal, undeniable. By the time we finished, it was thick enough to slam down like a gavel. Dean slid the packet across the desk toward me. Deliver this tomorrow. At the emergency shareholders meeting, Brian just accidentally triggered. I tucked the folder under my arm, felt the weight of it. Not heavy, satisfying. Like a sword sheathed, ready for the fight. Tomorrow I wouldn't just defend myself. I'd dismantle Brian's entire kingdom of lies piece by piece. And when I was finished, there wouldn't be enough left for him to even pretend he ruled anything. The emergency shareholders meeting was held in the old conference room at Merrick & Company, the one with the faded carpet and the portrait of Grandpa Merrick glaring down from the wall. I got there early, took a seat near the front, my packet of evidence resting on the table like a loaded gun. Brian arrived fashionably late, of course, burst through the double doors like he was grand marshal of a parade nobody asked for. Tight smile, nervous energy leaking from every twitch of his fingers. He clapped his hands once. Morning, everyone. Let's keep this quick and friendly, huh? Friendly. Right. Mom slipped in behind him, wearing a brittle smile that cracked when her eyes met mine. She didn't wave. Good. I wasn't here for pleasantries. The meeting opened with Brian launching into a dramatic speech. He painted a picture of chaos, Lisa's emotional breakdown, irrational accusations, endangering the company with frivolous lawsuits. He practically begged them to, quote, restore stability by reaffirming my leadership. I let him talk. Every lie, another shovel of dirt he was piling on his own grave. When he finally sat down, smirking like he'd nailed it, the room fell into a heavy, awkward silence. Dean, seated beside me, gave a tiny nod. Your turn. I stood up slowly, lifting the thick folder into the light where everyone could see. My name's Lisa Merrick, I said, voice carrying across the room like a clear bell. And unlike Brian, I came with facts. I passed out copies of the evidence packet, one to every shareholder. The rustling of pages filled the silence as they flipped through. I pointed to Exhibit A, the right of first refusal clause, still active, still binding. Exhibit B, emails, showing my $240,000 lifeline to the company during Dad's illness. Exhibit C, financial records showing Brian's reckless sales attempts, backed up by signed broker contracts. Each point hammered home, sharp and undeniable. Murmurs started rising around the room, frowns, whispers, glares aimed not at me, but at Brian. He shifted in his seat, sweat beading at his temples. She's twisting everything, he barked. She's emotional. I lifted a hand, silencing him without raising my voice. Emotion didn't wire $240,000 into the company account. Emotion didn't find the legal clause you ignored. Emotion didn't forge your reckless contracts. I leaned forward, hands planted on the table. Facts did? The shareholders' eyes shifted, away from Brian, toward me. I could almost feel the tide turning, slow but unstoppable. And when Mrs. Keating stood up, slow, proud, steady, and said, I move to hold a confidence vote. I smiled. Not wide, not triumphant, just certain. Because by the end of today, Brian Merrick wasn't just going to lose control. He was going to lose everything. The room buzzed as Mrs. Keating's motion hung in the air. Nobody moved for a long second. Then Mr. Hawthorne, one of the oldest shareholders, cleared his throat. I second the motion. Brian half rose from his chair, spluttering, You can't just... This isn't fair. Judge Carpenter's earlier words rang in my ears. Any attempt to interfere with ownership will be treated as contempt. I sat still. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to argue. Brian was already digging his own grave. All I had to do was watch. Mrs. Keating pulled out an ancient clipboard, probably older than Brian himself, and began calling names for the vote. Confidence in Brian Merrick? She said. Heads shook. Murmured no's floated across the room, one by one methodically. When she called my name, I answered calmly. No confidence. When she called Carol Merrick Mom, she hesitated. Her eyes darted to Brian, then to me. For a second, something almost like regret flickered across her face. But old habits die hard. Confidence, she said, barely above a whisper. It didn't matter. The numbers were against them. By the time the last name was called, Brian looked ready to leap across the table. Red-faced, fists clenched, breathing like a bull ready to charge. Mrs. Keating stood straighter, her voice clear. Result: 82% no confidence in Brian Merrick. Immediate removal from acting leadership effective today. Brian shoved his chair back so hard it screeched against the tile. You can't do this, I'm family, he shouted. I stood slowly, gathering my packet, feeling the solid floor under my boots like it was part of me. You're right, Brian, I said. You'll always be family. But you were never fit to lead Merrick and Company. Dean handed me a fresh folder, thicker and heavier than the first. Inside was the final paperwork, temporary CEO appointment, until the legal ownership transfer was finalized. I walked to the head of the table and placed the folder down like a crown reclaimed. Mrs. Keating nodded approvingly. The shareholders rose from their seats, not in protest, but in a soft, collective motion of agreement, as if some heavy, rotting weight had finally been lifted off this company's shoulders. Brian stood frozen, face purple with rage. Mom tugged at his arm, murmuring something in his ear. He yanked away, glaring at me with pure, helpless hatred. This isn't over, he spat. You think you've won, but you're nothing without us. I leaned down just enough that only he could hear me. I was nothing to you the day you handed me the keys and didn't realize it. Brian stormed out, slamming the door so hard the portrait of Grandpa Merrick rattled on its hook. Good. Let it shake. The foundation needed rebuilding anyway. The shareholders trickled out, murmuring to each other in low voices. Mrs. Keating gave my shoulder a squeeze on her way past. You did good, girl, she said. Then she was gone too. Only Mom stayed behind, standing stiff in the middle of the room like she didn't know whether to beg or to bolt. I didn't rush her. I gathered the folders, stacking them neatly, letting the silence stretch. Finally, she spoke. You don't have to be cruel, Lisa. Her voice cracked on my name. I tucked the last paper into my bag before looking at her. Cruel? I said, calm as a winter morning. I'm just enforcing the rules. The ones you ignored when it was convenient. She winced like I'd slapped her. But I stayed steady. No yelling, no tears. She stepped closer, wringing her hands. Your father's humiliated. Brian's, she faltered, shaking her head. This will destroy him. I shrugged, voice cool. He did that to himself. I'm just cleaning up the mess. Her lips trembled. You don't know what it's like to watch your child fail over and over. I looked her dead in the eyes. Yeah, I said, I do. Because you watched me sacrifice everything for this family, and you didn't lift a finger to help. The words hung heavy between us. No echoes, no excuses. She dropped her gaze to the stained carpet. We thought you didn't need us. I almost laughed. Instead, I slipped the final knife in, clean and surgical. You didn't think about me at all. Silence. Just the old fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above us. Finally, she straightened, pulling her coat tighter around her. How much? She asked, voice brittle. For our shares. Ah, there it was. The real reason she stayed. I pulled out a check from my bag. The one Dean and I had prepared the night before. A token sum. Enough for them to leave quietly, but nowhere near what they had hoped to wring from Brian's fantasy plans. I slid it across the table toward her. You want out? Here's your price. She stared at the number. Her face crumpled for a split second, then smoothed over like wet clay. She snatched the check without another word. I rose, gathering my bag. As of today, I said, my voice sharp enough to cut glass, you're no longer affiliated with Merrick & Company. Mom turned away, without looking back. The door swung shut behind her with a soft, final click. No slam, no screaming. Just an ending that had been a long time coming. I stood alone in the conference room, breathing in the thin, electric air of real freedom. The kind you don't ask for. The kind you take. The next morning, I unlocked the front doors of Merrick & Company for the first time as acting CEO. The keys felt heavier in my hand now. Real. Solid. Earned. The lobby smelled the same. lemon cleaner, and aging carpet. But somehow, the air felt different, lighter. The employees gathered in small clusters, whispering. When I walked in, the room went still. Dozens of eyes turned toward me, some wary, some hopeful. I stepped forward, voice steady. "Good morning," I said. "I know it's been a hell of a week." A few people chuckled. Nervous, but real. I continued. "There are going to be changes. Real ones. But not the kind you need to be afraid of." I paused, letting the words settle. "I'm not here to strip this place for parts. I'm here to rebuild it. And every one of you who stayed loyal, you're part of that rebuild." Tasha from accounting wiped her eyes. Mike from loading nodded, his arms crossed tight against his chest like he didn't dare hope too hard. I smiled, real and wide this time. "Let's get to work." The staff clapped, soft at first, then louder, until the lobby rang with it. I turned and headed toward the executive office, the one Dad had occupied for 25 years. My boots scuffed lightly against the scuffed hallway floor. No red carpet. No applause. Just exactly how it should be. I pushed open the heavy oak door. The room was a mess. Papers scattered, drawers half open, trophies leaning on cracked bases. Brian must have trashed the place before he stormed out. I sighed and rolled up my sleeves. First things first, clear the junk, reclaim the space. As I swept a broken frame off the desk, a corner of something white caught my eye, tucked behind the bottom drawer, barely visible. I crouched down and pulled it free. A crumpled envelope, yellowed with age, my name scrawled across it in Dad's handwriting. Not Brian's, mine. My heart thudded once, hard, against my ribs. I sat down heavily in the old leather chair and tore the envelope open. Inside was a letter, short, just a few lines. The ink shaky but determined. "Lisa, if you're reading this, it means the business survived another day, and probably because of you. I know I wasn't always fair. I know I didn't say it enough, but you were always the one I trusted most. Take care of it. It's yours now, Dad." I folded the letter carefully, setting it down on the clean corner of the desk. No parade, no fanfare, just the truth. Maybe too late, but still true. I leaned back in the chair, staring out the dusty window at the sun cutting through the clouds. It wasn't just about taking back American Company anymore. It was about building something better. I smiled grimly. Of course Brian wasn't going down without swinging, but neither was I.